You're listening to the Podcast Detroit Network. Visit www.podcastdetroit.com for more information.
Welcome to Smart Sex, Smart Love, where talking about sex goes beyond the taboos and talking about love goes beyond the honeymoon. I'm Dr. Joe Court. Thanks for tuning in. And welcome back to Smart Sex, Smart Love. Thanks for everyone for tuning in. This will be my last show of the season. This is season 1, but I look forward to chatting with more fabulous guests where talking about sex goes beyond the taboo and talking about love goes beyond the honeymoon. We'll be back in the fall. I'm going out with a bang this time. Today, I'm chatting about multicultural and cross-cultural relationship and sex therapy with my guest, Dr. Leyla Gulcur. Leyla is a licensed psychologist trained in the United States and provides multicultural sex and relationship therapy to culturally diverse clients around the globe. She has lived, worked, and traveled extensively in North America, Europe, the Middle East, North Africa, and South Asia. Leyla is originally from Turkey and conducts sessions in both English and Turkish. In addition to her clinical practice, Leyla has worked to strengthen sexual rights worldwide, particularly in Asia and the Middle East. She is the co-founder of the Turkish NGO Women for Women's Human Rights. Welcome, Leyla.
Thank you, Joe. I just had to unmute myself. Thank you so much for having me here.
Oh yeah, no problem. And it's kind of nice having you as the final guest of the season because this is a really current and important topic. And you've been doing this for way before it was in what's the word when it's in, it's in to be doing this, and everybody has begun understanding the intersectional identities and multicultural. So it's good to have somebody well seasoned in doing this.
Yeah, thank you. I think a lot of it is because of my own personal background. I grew up internationally. I'm what's considered what's called a third culture kid. And so I grew up from the age of 5 months up until now in many different countries of the world. So it's sort of in my blood.
That's great. It's in your blood and it's in your work. So let's start with the basic, right? So people are tuning in and they're going to want to know, what are we talking about? What's multicultural sex and relationship therapy? Can you define it?
Yes, I can. So it's actually not very easy to define, but the way and different people define it in different ways. But the way that I use multicultural therapy is taking into consideration the sort of the different components of what makes a cultural background. It's not just culture; it's class, race, ethnicity, gender identity, expression, sexual orientation, spiritual diversity. And taking into account the background of my clients and the idea that you can actually have more than one cultural identity. So I work a lot with clients who are either themselves multicultural or bicultural. They're a product of two different cultures, and or couples who where one person comes from one culture and the other person comes from another culture. So the main goal of working from a multicultural therapeutic framework is to acknowledge and be explicit and highlight and work with these cultural backdrops, so to speak, and how do they show up in sex and relationships.
So what kinds of issues do you see in these couples when they come to your office?
There's a million of them. So from a couple's perspective, what ends up happening is that if I'm working with couples who are either bicultural or multicultural themselves, or more frequently where one person is from one culture and the other person is from another culture, there are times when the relationship communication and the sexual communication are out of sync. So, for example, I'll give you one example. What happens very frequently with intercultural couples, where one couple comes from a cultural background where sex is talked about, and the other person comes from a cultural background where sex was not talked about when they were growing up. In the bedroom, oftentimes there's not a lot of communication that comes from the person who never learned how to talk about sex. So for some people, they didn't even have a word for genitalia, for vulvas or penises. It was either down there or I know in Turkish, for example, we use these really childish names like gugu and pipi. And then sometimes there's actually no words whatsoever. So it becomes very much of a barrier to healthy sexuality and healthy sexual communication at times.
So really, in a way, that's not as unusual as it is here in the United States, where people can come from different cultures and right here and always been raised here, or different religions, and have different ways of, or not lack of ways of talking about sex. Is that correct?
Sorry, I didn't understand what you meant. Say that again.
Well, like you're saying, so they might come from different nationalities, different cultures, and so one might not be able to talk about sex and not know how to do it or have not the right words, whereas someone else might. But what we see that here in the United States is it
yes, absolutely. So I don't necessarily make a distinction between countries versus the United States. The same multicultural issues or multicultural or intercultural differences or challenges may show up here with couples in the United States as well. But it's really a matter of what background you come from, what was discussed in your family of origin, and how you bring that into your relationship, regardless of whether you're an American citizen who's white versus an American citizen who comes from a South Asian background or an American citizen who comes from another background.
That's helpful. What do you think therapists don't know that you teach therapists about working in this area? What are the common things that therapists misunderstand?
Well, I think probably the biggest issue that I have to work with therapists, and this is somewhat controversial. I'm part of several therapist groups, both in person as well as on Facebook. And one of the bigger controversies is what role does the therapist's own cultural background and ideology play in the therapy that they do? And I think this is a very, very important issue. Because some therapists say you shouldn't be bringing in your cultural background and your preferences and your ideologies into the therapy session. I'm one of those therapists who does not believe that. I think that it's very important to be explicit about where I come from, what my values are, because if I'm not explicit about those, I may not necessarily be able to serve people who come from a very different perspective. So, for example, I come from a feminist perspective. I spent a lot of my professional life working in the international women's rights area for many, many years, especially sexual rights. So I may not be able to serve, let's say, a heterosexual couple who comes in where the idea is that the woman shouldn't speak or the woman shouldn't express her sexual needs, right? So if I were to actually have a couple who comes to me with that in mind, I would have to be very explicit about where I come from and then let them decide whether they want to go with that or not, right? And it's a bit of a controversial thing a stance to take.
I'm so supportive of what your stance is, because people said that to me as a gay therapist in the 90s. You should leave that out. Nobody talks about that. That's your issue, not their issue. And yet, I always said, if you're heterosexual, it's already out into the room. It's already assumed. It's aligned. You're wearing your wedding ring. Sometimes therapists have pictures of their partners and children on the. So it was already out there. And you think it's just that it's their discomfort or their lack of understanding, right?
Well, it is, but I think, and I don't know, I think different professions have different ethical guidelines, right? And there is sort of an expectation of objectivity, not objectivity, but being able to be empathic, right, as a therapist and to support people wherever they are. But I think there's limits to that. So if there's racism in the therapy session, or if there's sexism or homophobia in the therapy session, and this is coming from a particular cultural framework, that either the individual client or the couple, the couple might be struggling with this as well, right? Like with heterosexual couples, it's very often the sexism, and it's not talked about. Then it's a bit of a balancing act between being empathic and supportive, and also addressing these structural inequalities that do come from culture, right? They're systemic, and they get internalized into individuals.
Yes, yeah, that makes sense. Can you talk about, your work includes sexual migration and sexual acculturation, and how does multicultural sex and relationship therapy address that?
Yes, so I work a lot with two groups of people who've migrated. One is LGBTQ individuals who've migrated from more restrictive countries to the United States. And I also work with heterosexual women who've migrated from more sexually restrictive countries to the United States. So to give an example, I work a lot with women who are either from the Middle East or South Asia, who have explicitly, part of their decision to migrate to either the United States or to Europe has been because they experienced sexual oppression in their countries of origin. So, for example, in the Middle East, premarital virginity is a very strong cultural norm, even with women who don't agree with it. But there's a lot of external pressure to be a virgin until you get married. And regardless of whether women abide by that or not in their country of origin, a lot of the women that I've talked to who have migrated to the United States have told me that explicitly one of the reasons was so that they could escape some of that pressure. Mm. Now they may carry that pressure with them, which is what we talk about in the therapy sessions to try to unravel it. But so sexual migration and LGBTQ individuals also, it's a different kind of pressure, right? It's the homophobia pressure. And so a lot of LGBTQ individuals that I've talked with from, again, those countries have said that a large part of the reason why they decided to migrate to the United States or Europe is to escape that pressure.
Yeah. Now, what do you think? I don't know if you have a thought about this, but it boggles my mind. I talk with people that live in Saudi Arabia, that live in Iraq, that live in places where it's a crime to identify or be, have homosexual behavior. You can be prosecuted in some of these countries. You can be killed. And when you talk to people who live there, they say, no, that's not how it is here. I know people think that, but that's not true. But then you read about it in the news and it's true. Why do people, it seems like people have a denial around it that actually live there?
Yeah, I don't know, because most of the people that I know, let's say the community of people that I hang out with in Turkey, that denial is not there. So I'm not so sure who those people are.
Yeah, it's bizarre. I mean, maybe they're separated. The kind of clients I get may have a higher socioeconomic status, so they're removed from it. I don't know. But I cannot begin to tell you how many people say, no, that's just not true. It's media driven. And I know.
In other words, that there is no homosexuality?
No, I'm sorry. No crime, no criminal acts against them. There's no, they cannot, in 20 countries in this world, you can be euthanized or castrated simply for being homosexual. And Saudi Arabia, I think, is one of them. Iraq, I know, is one of them. Is Turkey? I don't know.
I think legally in Turkey, and again, don't quote me on this, but I think there is no legal ramifications. In other words, legally, there's nothing against homophobia. Against homosexuality. But having said that, there are a lot of trans people who've been killed, and yes, LGBTQ people get harassed and discriminated against all the time. So whether there are laws or not, I don't think is the issue. It's what happens to your experience living in society. Yeah. And that's part of also the sexual migration experience. And the second piece of it, which is the sexual acculturation experience, I think is also important to bring up here, which is acculturation doesn't happen in a linear fashion. So even if people are, let's say, escaping more sexually restrictive practices in a country of origin and then moving into Europe or the United States, that doesn't mean that they're giving up their culture of origin. It doesn't mean that the culture of origin is all bad, because we also have to take into consideration this idea of colonialism, and then seeing the U.S. and Europe as being perfect versus these other countries as being horrible. Mm-hmm. It's not black and white like that. So there are things that people do to acculturate sexually where they pick and choose the things that work for them. So, for example, in the United States, the high level of individualism may not work for somebody who needs a community. I mean, for example, in Turkey, people are kind of more spontaneously together. I'll give you an example of sort of heterosexual sexuality here. There's no, for example, even if you are having sex or hookup sex or casual sex with somebody in the Turkish context, very often the next day you will hang out and have breakfast together. So I had talked about how sexual acculturation isn't linear, and that you get to, like in sexual acculturation, you get to pick and choose the pieces of your original culture that you want to bring with you into wherever you're going, and then whatever pieces you want to adopt from the culture that you're going to or reject, right? So I was talking about how in casual hookup sex in the United States, that there's generally an expectation that the next day you don't hang out or you don't spend the day together, right? Because hookup sex means you just go away and then don't really talk to the other person again. Whereas in a country like Turkey or another Middle Eastern country, if you are having casual hookup sex, which most people don't, there is still more of a convivial together, let's be together the next day, right? Let's have breakfast the next day and then we'll say goodbye to each other. Or let's hang out the next day a little bit and then we'll say goodbye to each other.
So really, that's the struggle that people have is, how far away do they want to go from the world they came from and the country they came from and the values, and how much do they want to assimilate into the United States kind of culture? Is that right?
Not exactly. It's not an either or thing. So it's really more about which pieces of my original culture worked for me that I want to keep, and which pieces of the new culture work for me that I want to keep, and then which pieces that don't work for me in both cultures do I want to not keep.
Okay.
And that's how I sexually acculturate.
Okay. So what are the top three things people struggle with? Like, I know the LGBTQ, that makes sense. And then you said heterosexual women, and what are the top issues that they struggle with?
So especially for women coming from the Middle East, one of the top issues is the sexual controls that they have had to grow up with, where virginity really is a signifier of the woman's honor, the family's honor, the community's honor. And so there's a lot of pressure on an individual heterosexual woman from the Middle East to carry that honor by being a virgin, whether she is or not. Like, a lot of women reject it. They rebel against it, but that pressure is still there, and the shaming that goes on is still there if it turns out that people find out that you're not a virgin. So that's one piece that women struggle with. Another piece, I think, is and this is probably related. The vaginismus is much higher in women, heterosexual women from the Middle East than in other parts of the world. And the sort of the explanation, or the hypothesis, is that it's related to this cultural pressure to be a virgin as it shows up in the body, right? It's somaticized.
And when you say vaginismus, so for people that know, it's vaginal pain during intercourse or any kind of penetration.
Yes, any kind of penetration is either impossible or it's extremely painful. Yeah.
So then, how do you help them? What advice do you give them?
Well, it has to be multimodal, right? So part of it is the talk therapy piece, which is talking about how sort of the external pressure of having to be a virgin, and how that has showed up in the anxiety or the sort of the discomfort for the woman, the client, but also to work at it at the somatic level. Now, in the United States, the treatment for vaginismus includes things like dilators, vaginal dilators. So that includes penetration or pelvic floor massage. Women who come from the Middle East might not want to have people insert their fingers into their vagina to massage them, right?
Yeah.
So dilators and pelvic massage may not work for a woman who's dealing with the pressure of virginity or insertion. The idea of insertion, it's not even it gets translated from virginity into fear of insertion. So you can't necessarily always work with a woman the same way you would work with somebody from the United States, where insertion may not be an issue. So in those instances, I might use other somatic methodologies. So I use a technique that comes from Eugene Gendling called focusing, where you really focus on where the fear is, how it shows up in your body, and oftentimes it's in the genital area, right? So there's a somatic visualization exercise that I go through with women. I will also use sort of like a narrative analysis to get to core beliefs that have to do with the fear itself. So what happens if you're not a virgin, and then you go down and you go down and you go down, and really it usually comes down to a very existential place of being completely alone, rejected and alone, right? Ostracized, rejected and alone. And the emotional awareness of that creates changes in the inside. So I work both at the mental level as well as at the somatic level. And the other piece that I bring in is I am trained also as a Tai Chi teacher and medical Qigong therapist. So I bring in some Chinese, traditional Chinese methodologies into it. There are exercises, both breathing as well as physical exercises that you can do that don't require insertion, right? That are geared towards women that I will teach women, and they can do those at home as well.
So LGBTQ for sure, you talked about the issues, heterosexual women. Are there any issues that you see amongst heterosexual men?
In general, the issues with heterosexual men that I work with that come up with either intercultural couples or individual men themselves is really the idea of sort of socializing or re-socializing to think about sex as not being like a Masters and Johnson linear type of sex where the expectation is you get aroused, you get an erection, you have an orgasm, and then you kind of go to sleep and snore, right? And the idea is to move away from an orgasm focus and a penetration focus to what is called more circular sexuality. Rosemary Basson and Lulin talk about it this way, which is much more feminine centric. And you don't have to start from a place of arousal. You can start from a place of willingness. You can start from a place of non-orgasmic pleasure. Whether the orgasm happens or not is kind of incidental. So that the idea is to become open to not just having a goal orientation. But I don't necessarily think that this is just a cultural issue, because I think heterosexual US men, right, have very similar. Yeah, exactly. So it's much more of a patriarchal issue rather than a, universal sort of masculine heterosexual issue than a cultural issue. I mean, some things cut across all cultures.
And this might be my own stereotype and bias, so call me on it if it is. But I would think, though, that it would be harder to get men in other countries on board with that more feminine way of being sexual than it is for the men here. It's hard enough here, but I would think even more so from men like from Turkey or Iraq or Saudi Arabia. Is that off?
Again, it depends on the socialization. So if there are a lot of men who self-identify even in Turkey as feminists, right? So it's much easier to work with a man who is more progressive, more liberal, to sort of re-socialize. But yes, if you're working with somebody who is from a rural area and who has not been exposed to sort of different ideas, it really depends on how rigid the gender role expectations are.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And again, I don't know if that's just it's not necessarily cultural, because I don't know if you were to go. I don't have a lot of experience with rural America, but because I live in I work with people in New York, mostly in the United States. I'm assuming that you would get the same rigidity possibly, and this might be my bias. Correct me if I'm wrong. Sure. This might be my bias.
Yeah.
Right? Where if you grow up in a very homogenous community, you may not be willing to look at other ways of having sex.
Yes, that makes sense too. All right. Well, how can people find you if they want to learn more from you or know more about you?
They can go to my website, which is my first name, last name.com. So Leyla Gulcur. And I'm also on Psychology Today, and they can also find me through my NYU website. I also teach at NYU.
Okay.
If they just Google my name, I think I might be one of the only two people with my name in the whole world. So it's a very rare name. So if they Google me, they'll find me.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you, Leyla. Thank you so much, really, for being on the show. And I'd like to thank everybody for listening. We've had a really great first season. We did a ton of shows, and I can't wait to get back recording into season 2 in the fall. In the meantime, don't forget to follow me on Instagram and Twitter at Dr. Joe Court, DrJoeKort. And please rate, review, and subscribe to my podcast. Over the summer, you can catch up on any of my episodes that you've missed at smartsexsmartlove.com. See you next season. Have a safe and healthy summer. Thanks for listening to this episode of Smart Sex, Smart Love. I'm Dr. Joe Court, and you can find me on joecourt.com.